Okay, well, welcome everybody. It's great to see you all. Um, and I'm really looking forward to another conversation on the future of work and well-being. I quickly want to acknowledge the National Science Foundation as they're partially funding this effort. And of course, I'd like to have a shout out to our co-organizers, Linda Boyle, John Lee, Raffaella, Sadun, Manfred Chelligy, and of course, Orit, Shaer, and myself are here today. So again, this is a recorded conversation, and then please post your questions in the chat, and then Orit will be looking at those and calling on you to talk to us. And it's really a pleasure to welcome Caitlin Mills. Caitlin and I have been collaborating now for, I don't know, a couple of years. Caitlin is an assistant professor in psychology at the University of New Hampshire. And she came here from the University of British Columbia, where she completed a postdoc. And before that, she was at Notre Dame. And Caitlin, let me just jump right in. So your focus is on mind wandering. And so I think we all have this intuitive understanding of what that is. What is mind wandering? But how do you think about mind wandering as a researcher? What is this? And are there different kinds of mind wandering?
Great. Good question. So first, thanks for having me. Really appreciate you guys letting me come talk, and thanks to everyone for attending on Zoom. So when you say people have an intuitive sense of mind wandering, I think that's definitely true. So you can basically trace the use of the words like, oh, my mind was wandering, or I was letting my mind wander, or wandering mind, like back in literature for a really long time. And even like the father of psychology, William James, like wrote about things like the flights and the perchings of the mind, kind of alluding to this sort of phenomenon. There was a brief hiatus in psychology where we did not think people had that capability, but luckily we're past that now. So quickly, for those of you who are not currently mind wandering, I want you to think about, like, if I just said, okay, my mind's wandering, think about how you would define that, right? So what would be the sort of quintessential case that you would think of if I said my mind was wandering? Like, what would that mean to you? And just take like maybe just 10 seconds and think about what that means. Okay, so we'll come back to that, and maybe you can join in the conversation and actually tell me what you thought it meant. But I do want to say, so in general, this has only been a topic of like scientific inquiry for like about 15 years, which is really short compared to a lot of other things. So we're still sort of on a trajectory of learning how to define it and what it is. And so I think I kind of wanted to say that disclaimer up front. But the vast majority in the last 15 years have taken a pretty simple operational definition of what it means to mind wander, and just think about off-task thought. So are you wandering from a task that you're doing to something else? So any thought that's not about the current task would be considered to be mind wandering. So for many of you, that's probably what you sort of thought of, is that I wasn't focused on whatever I was supposed to be doing. But for others of you, you might have had sort of a different take on what that meant. And so I just want to say that off-task thought definition, though, is very important, because it actually has a lot of like functional correlates and occurs a lot. So I mean, so we measure that by asking people when they're doing either like an everyday life or any task they're doing, are you off task right now or not? And people will say that they're mind wandering like strikingly a lot. So like we're talking about 50% of the time in your everyday life. If I were to just randomly ask you throughout what your everyday, you would say yes about 50% of the time, which is a lot. So at work, there's been a few studies that have asked people, like, you know, what if they're mind wandering at work, for example, and you're still getting over 30% of the time. People are like, yep, not focused on what I'm currently doing. So, I mean, that's it. The off-task thought definition alone is important for us to pay attention to, because it does explain a lot. It's negatively related to things like performance. It's also related to things like clinical health symptomatology, and in some cases have some benefits like creativity, for example. So it has a lot of correlates that we should care about. But as I mentioned, you may notice that that's not sort of a clear-cut definition, because your mind may be off task for many different reasons, which seems kind of important to quantify. So you might go off task because you're super worried about what you have to do later, or you might go off task because you have this like amazing insight. And those feel like sort of phenomenologically two different types of thoughts. And so more recently, people have kind of either empirically or theoretically tried to break down what that means a little further. And so there's one line of research which has tried to say, okay, well, you may go off task because intentionally, so you choose to go off task, or you may go off task unintentionally, so it's sort of accidental. And so, for example, in some of the research we've done, if you're rereading something for the second time, you're much more likely to go off task intentionally. And that makes sense, right? Because you've already read it, so you know it, so you're going to choose to not like really read that text as attentively. But beyond the task itself, we can also try to sort of understand theoretically why thoughts are unfolding and how they're unfolding over time. So rather than just saying, are you on or off task in this given minute, we can say, well, how are your thoughts sort of unfolding in a more dynamic way? And here we can think about sort of a more theoretical perspective that's focusing on the dynamics of, okay, are your thoughts constrained? So are you like deliberately directing them, or are they being pulled somewhere? So like, this is in the case of worries or rumination. So you're not deliberately directing them towards those worries, but they're being pulled there. So that's another type. So like, again, directed, or they're being pulled somewhere, or are they sort of more freely moving? Or are they sort of bouncing around, making associations without, they're unguided. You can sort of think of it as that. And so that perspective is less about whatever task you're doing and more about how the thoughts are unfolding over time. So a very simple way to think about this maybe is like, on one hand, mind wandering might be wandering off a task. And then in another case, it might be wandering around or sort of unguided and freely moving.
So you mentioned this a little bit about bad and good. And so what, it's kind of evident, I guess, that if you're not paying attention to what you're doing, it might be bad for work. But what are the good cases? What are the cases where it might be helpful, and what kind of mind wandering, and what tasks or what sorts of work might be benefiting from mind wandering?
Right. So I'll just say that the task, like when we think about the off task part, so you can do this in like different, performance or problem solving, or like in educational context. And we do find, and some of the members in my lab who are on this call now have been working on like a meta-analysis to actually try to quantify that effect size. And it is it's very consistently a negative correlation. So we're looking at somewhere between like -0.2 to -0.3 of a correlation. So if you think about that in terms of like an effect size, it's negative, it's consistently negative, but it's not actually very strong. So we're not explaining a ton of variance in performance or comprehension, things like that. And part of that might be kind of what you're getting at, which is that there might be different types of mind wandering that's happened. Some of them might be helpful, some of them might not be. So if you're just blatantly off task, it's probably bad. But maybe in some cases, as like my grad student Shelby, who's here, has looked at, is like, maybe if you're like at work, or you're trying to read a document and you're making some sort of like personal connection with that material. And so you're bridging what's happening in what you're working on to something in everyday life. And it's sort of letting you make associations. In that case, it might actually like mitigate the negative effect of just going off task, because you're actually strengthening your model of whatever you're trying to do. And so that's more about, I guess, comprehension or learning. But in other cases, we can think about creativity or creative processes. And here, the idea of creativity or the creative process is that generally you need to have some sort of like generation of the ideas, and then also an evaluation of the ideas. So you can kind of think about it like this, like flip-flop thinking kind of thing, where you can't just have like blatant unconstrained thoughts where you're just generating a ton of ideas, because you need to evaluate if those ideas are useful or novel, or like, are they going to make an impact in the world, right? So we recently published more of a theoretical paper talking about, if we think about mind wandering in this dynamic perspective way, we can think about how thoughts would unfold and jump around in different spaces, and sort of like a landscape, almost like a simulated annealing type process, where we're sort of like honing to get to this better, more and more creative idea. And in this case, it's probably the case that when you have unconstrained thought, you're thinking of more associations and better ideas, but then you still need to switch back and evaluate them. And so you can't only be mind wandering. You still need to have this like thoughtful process too. And so it's really a combination of those. But the idea of having that unconstrained thought and more like unguided thought is probably still going to help you get to more novel associations.
So just switching to a different topic. Gloria Mark was one of our guests, and she talked about email and how people get really, you know, email is something that induces nervousness and negative feelings. And I'm curious regarding your work. You have this paper, TLDR, and which means too long didn't read. And I think this is a common joke, but this is a common joke about emails, right? It's just too long, I didn't read it. It's just overwhelming. So how do you think we should be writing emails? Do you have any insight as to, you know, the TLDR work that you did, and then one big part of our work is always emails. So
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
I guess the broad message is shorter is better. I think so. In this study, so I mentioned earlier about unintentional and intentional different types of off-task thought. And so in this study, people read, and the texts were controlled, so they would read like shorter versions or longer versions. And I think interestingly, people reported more unintentional task unrelated thought when they were reading the longer sections of text, and they also perceived that to be more difficult. So the idea is, you know, one interpretation is that if you open up at your email and you see that someone has written you this very long email, you're probably gonna maybe feel like it's a more difficult thing to read. And then without even, you're not intentionally going off task, it's actually unintentional. So I think that the message would be very clear to write short, sweet emails so that people can stay on task and read them and respond in an adequate amount of time before losing their attention.
That makes sense to me. So
yes, feels much better.
So what do you think we can do about mind wandering? Are there some strategies? Are there interventions that can help us mitigate it?
Yes. So one way to think about it, I guess, especially for like people who may be teaching or people who are in like long meetings in a room where they're trying to get people to digest the information that they're delivering. You can think about like proactive interventions. So we're trying to think of like stopping it before it actually happens. And things that can be helpful for this are some sort of like interpolated testing, for example. So periodically asking people to answer questions. This is may seem somewhat intuitive, but just stopping people to get them to answer questions will actually keep them engaged for longer or like more chunks of time, right? And then on the other hand, there's some like mindfulness practice studies that have shown that we might also be able to reduce it proactively by doing more mindfulness training. The results on that are somewhat more mixed, but it's kind of interesting to think about. If you do brief mindfulness, then you're able to stay on task for longer. And then finally, on the other side though, so we can't ever reduce it. There's been, I don't think any study that I know of that has ever, no matter how interesting they find something to be or how engaging the person is speaking, you just can't get people to stop it altogether. There's no way to reduce it to zero. And so then that raises the question of how do we do like reactive intervention? So this might be something in the context of like learning or maybe driving, right? Where you're never going to stop people from doing it, but how do you determine when it's actually bad? And then when do you want to come in? And so far there's been some promising work with eye gaze, for example. So we recently have a paper that came out where we were able to detect and respond in real time while people were reading using their eye gaze. So the idea is that when we think that they're really off task and they don't get it, we stop them and say, hey, can you make sure that you got what you just read? And if they did get it, they get to move on. That's great. You understand it, so you're not going to have this like cascading effect. But if they didn't get it, like it scored in real time, they had to go back and reread so that they're not missing any information as they proceed. And something similar could happen with other detectors that are currently being built with things like Vishal, who I think is on this call, has built a nice detector using keystrokes. So you can tell when people are typing based on how they're typing, whether or not they're more likely to be mind wandering or not. So there's a lot of avenues for potential reactive interventions as well.
So I'd like to transition to some questions from the audience, since we have them coming in. But before that, I really kind of want to ask my question. So I'm going to ask about well-being. So we talked a little bit about kind of the correlation between work-related measurement, like negative correlation with productivity and questionable correlation with creativity. But I want to ask about correlation with well-being measure. Are people that have the freedom to mind wander happier? Are they more miserable? Does it depend the time of the day that you mind wander, or to what directions?
I'm very glad that you asked this question, because I'm gonna like nerd out about this for a second. But so there's this paper that's like it's actually a really great paper, and it's one of the, I think, papers that put the field on the map in some ways. And it was published in Science, and it's called a wandering mind is an unhappy mind. And it's I mean, I think in less like in a decade, it has like almost 3,000 citations. Like, it's a very popular paper. And there they find, and what's been replicated many times since then, is that when people report being off task, they also report being less happy. So it's not that they're miserable, like the means are kind of end up being sort of in the middle, or slightly, sometimes even slightly positive. But the important part is that when you're off task, most people will report being less happy than when they're on task. And the reasons for that, I think, are still kind of open for debate. So it could just be that when you're on task, you feel better, and when you are off task, you realize you're failing or are not on task. But we recently did a study at UNH looking at, so that's the off-task dimension that we've talked about, right? And so this other idea, which is like the more free movement or unconstrained kind of thinking, what we were doing is, okay, so we know off-task is negative. What about this other dimension that sometimes may feel better because it's more freeing? And what we find is the opposite relationship. So off-task is more negative, but when people are reporting letting their thoughts wander or being free, like freely moving, then you have a positive relationship with like affective state. So you're more likely to feel happy. So hopefully that will be some evidence that, it's not all bad for in terms of well-being or affective state.
Good, thank you. This is fascinating. I have more questions, but I want to give a chance to other people to ask them too. Diana, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. So I know you mentioned kind of evaluating a thought to, like, we have to have that process before you get to the better ideas as you're brainstorming. So I'm kind of wondering how intermittently you capture your thoughts, because, you're brainstorming, you're mind wandering, you're going off the task. So how do we make sure that, like, those kernels of ideas that might have a nugget of truth to them, we are capturing them? Does that make sense?
I think so. I think the answer is, unfortunately, potentially, that we don't really, maybe. So I think that you can think of it probably like more of like a honing process, where you might have this like kernel of idea, and if you give that kernel some value, right, and you're like, this is a good idea, then it sort of has like a higher probability of becoming something that you want to focus on later. Whereas many times, right, we have an idea, it has no value to us, or we don't think it's a viable way forward. So then we're like, okay, move that to the low probability pile kind of thing. And so, I think that the question, hopefully I'm answering it, but another interesting thing is like how meta aware you are of your thoughts. So oftentimes we have no idea what we're thinking about. Our stream of consciousness feels very uninterrupted. There's no breaks in it, right? Like, we experience the world as a very like nice movie that never has any breaks in it. But we're oftentimes still not aware of what our thoughts are in any given moment. And this is the phenomenon that you might have where, like, you're reading, I don't know how many of you read real books, like physical books anymore, but the phenomenon you have where you're reading and then you go to flip a page and you're like, oh wow, I have no idea what I just read in the last page, because you weren't meta aware at that time of what was actually happening. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think what you're trying to say is the ideas filter themselves out. So if I thought I had a brilliant idea at 3 a.m., but I forgot about it, it probably wasn't that brilliant.
Well, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that people have these insights. And when in the middle of the night, right? Which is kind of interesting to think about how your thoughts are probably less constrained at night. And so that could be why you're having those, but you may not have the ability to do the evaluation then. So it may not be that those ideas aren't good. It just may be that in that moment, it's that you have lower ability to evaluate them, to tag them as being important.
Thank you.
But I don't know, this is just my speculation to be like this to this question. Don't take this as empirical evidence.
So I think that's a good segue to Nadia's question. Nadia.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm like going off. So when Andrew mentioned getting emails, so I was thinking that like when I get an email, then I start mind wandering. Like that triggers that process for me, however focused I was before it. So like I was wondering, like in terms of like creating a like high performance working environment, if you will, like you mentioned that you can't like zero out mind wandering, but like are there like steps that we can take to like like reduce those triggers if there are any?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I think the idea of the email pop-up is something that all of us probably relate to because we keep a browser open with email, right? And so some of that, like if you get that, some of that can be classified as not necessarily mind wandering, but more of like a distraction. So if you have this thing that pulls your attention away and then you switch, it's more of like either multimedia, multitasking, or a distraction. But I think to your question, in terms of one of the things that is often the contents of when we have these like task unrelated thoughts is current concerns. So if we have things that feel like unresolved to us or goals that are not resolved, then they're more likely to come up. And the email is a big one. So if you get the ding, you know that you have an email and then you're still trying to focus, you've sort of elevated that. Now you know that you have this thing that you need to do. And so it's more prominent on your mind because it's become this concern that you need to address. And so that, you know, beyond the fact that just having more things to pay attention to is going to increase our like, you know, cognitive load at a basic level, then having those things, taking those potential current concerns away or potential distractions away is probably one way to produce a better work environment. That being said, that's not to say that you're not just going to find something else to trigger an off-task thought that you're working on. In some cases, like it's kind of interesting. Like think of a world where you can't do that, where you cannot have an off-task thought, and then all of a sudden we're really thankful for them.
So Caitlin, you mentioned kind of, in addition to mind wandering, you mentioned distraction and you mentioned multitasking, which kind of leads to visual question. Visual, are you there?
Yes.
Okay.
So I wanted to ask if it is possible for somebody to be focused on two tasks at once. Let's say I'm working on two tasks simultaneously, task A and task B, which are relatively simple tasks. And I switch from task A to task B while being aware of task A. Will that still be considered as mind wandering?
Well, this is a good question because it does highlight the problem with the defining mind wandering as task unrelated, because with task A and task B, then you have to define what your primary task is in order to be task unrelated, right? And so this does kind of highlight the issue with that more strict definition, which is that you have a primary task, and anytime you go off of that, this is off task, so you're mind wandering. But if you have task A and task B, which are both considered your task at any given moment, then maybe switching from task A to task B is not mind wandering. But this is more of, I think, what you're doing is pointing out the sort of philosophical problems with defining it in terms of a task potentially. But I think maybe to go back to and one answer to your question though is that some people just do better at task switching. So for some people, they might be able to go between task A and task B relatively easily without losing any sort of productivity on the other task better than others. But I think that if you define task A as your primary task, anytime you switch over to task B, it's not necessarily mind wandering, right? Because you're choosing to switch over and do something, and you're still deliberately thinking about that task. You're just alternating between tasks but not necessarily mind wandering. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks.
Right, thank you. And Hannah has a question that takes us to a slightly different direction. Hannah?
Yeah, hi. Hi, Caitlin. Thanks for this talk. I think it's a really interesting, topic for me. And my question is about if you've done any study on the relationship between mind wandering and memory. And this is something that I've sort of mind wandered myself. When I'm intensely, focused on something, I can remember it very well and in detail. But not so often when I'm mind wandering all the time. But I wonder if so I wonder if, like, when people mind wander, are they able to recall those thoughts very well or in detail? I wonder also if yes, and maybe if that's dependent on the type of mind wandering that they're doing. For example, if I'm just checking my phone and being on Reddit, I cannot recall anything that I do, during that space of time. But maybe if I'm thinking about, something random that seems interesting to me, I might be able to recall it better. So wondering if you've done any study on that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I haven't personally studied that. A lot of stuff that I focus on is sort of trying to determine when it will happen more, and less about the actual content of it. But I think what is that sort of you I think answered your own question by suggesting that it would likely depend, and some other research has done something similar where, like, it seems to depend on what people are thinking about. So if you are trying to, you're like, many of you are probably not on task right now, and if you go off task and you're like, oh, planning what you're doing later, that's probably a different type of thought than if I say something that made some random connection to something else that feels very unimportant to you that you may not remember, like later this afternoon. And so it's probably very content dependent in that case, and also dependent on how important you think those thoughts are that you're having, or like if you're meta aware of them. Like, as we described earlier, there's many times where you're not even aware of what you're thinking about, and so that probably changes things as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I have one more question, which has to kind of related to Nadia's question about triggers for mind wandering, but comes from the other direction. So if we design an interface to help people do their work, and let's focus on one domain. Let's say, like, we help people to, be focused when they're driving and to be able to switch between tasks. How can we help them? How can we help them control mind wandering, or how can we make sure that the task engages them enough to reduce mind wandering?
I wish I knew the exact answer to this, but one of the things that seems to be important is, for example, the level of difficulty that the task presents. And so there's no sort of one size fits all, but, like, if you're doing a task, so for example, reading, oftentimes if you're perceiving the reading as being more difficult, people will report going off task more generally. And so we've found this in many different studies, where if the people actually understand that it's more difficult and they think that, they're more likely to go off task. But if you're doing a task probably more similar to driving, for example, people are going to be more likely to report going off task. And I think Maxim's data actually shows this in the Pong game, which is and people have done it with, like, sustained attention tests. In this case, you actually get the flip side, where people report being off task more when it's easy. And so I think that seems to be one of the biggest considerations if you're designing a task, is how do you find sort of the sweet spot where you're getting people engaged, maybe at this, like, zone of proximal, like, engagement, where you're it's not too difficult where they think it's difficult and they want to just totally zone out, but it's not too easy where they have so much extra space to think about something else.
So kind of just a follow-up, I think that's kind of this finding this sweet spot in between. For how long can we sustain a sweet spot? So let's say that I do find this magical sweet spot in which you engage in the task, you're busy enough to kind of focus on it. Does it have a time limit? Can people is it a sweet spot for a little while and then it becomes too easy or too difficult or just too repetitive?
Yeah, I think that's, like, in terms of lab studies, one of the potential limitations right now, at least with respect to mind wandering, So like I have some colleagues who have looked at mind wandering, for example, across an entire semester. And and it turns out that it's not the case that people are just going to like increasingly mind wander more every time they come to class, right? Because there's a limit to how far you're going to go up. But if you look at it, for example, across one online video lecture that you're doing in isolation, you might see it go up over time. But so I think that's a great question that I don't know the answer to about how long people can maintain in terms of mind wandering. I do think that, you know, there's like a ton of research showing that chunking in terms of like video lectures, keep them short so people can stay on task. But I think one of the questions that I have that I can't answer is actually, so yeah, we know that this is going to be sort of like a dynamic process where like over time things are going to change, people are going to habituate. We need to sort of take that into account. But we also need to take into account, when do we actually care about it? Because like we talked about earlier, the fact that you can mind wander is actually most of the time a huge benefit to us. And we're like very thankful for that possibility, because staying on task all the time would feel probably horrible to us. So it's like, but when does it matter? When do we need to actually worry about responding and trying to reduce it versus just assuming all of it is bad? I think is a question that hopefully will be answered someday.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. This has been fascinating.
Thank you very much. This was really fun.
Thanks for having me.